again, and welcome to the Classic English Literature Podcast. This is the show that gives rhyme its reason. Today, we're going to start what will surely be a multi-episode look at the work of John Milton, whom many regard as the greatest English poet after Shakespeare. Some even rank him above Shakespeare, but those people are high. No, I'm just kidding, but I'm firmly Team Will on this one. Regular listeners will know that we have brushed up against Mr. Milton before in our episode on the English Civil Wars. During that turbulent period, he wrote largely as a pro-parliamentarian polemicist, and those puritanical sympathies will be much in evidence as we explore his work. A more general audience will perhaps know Milton by his magnificent octopus, Paradise Lost, far and away the greatest epic poem in the English language. Sorry, Beowulf. Sorry, Fairy Queen. You're great and all, but Paradise Lost is mwah. But that epic is for another day. We need to build up to it, just as Milton himself did, actually. You see, in the early modern period, aspiring poets followed a loosely structured progression that kind of functioned as an informal apprenticeship. Basically, like learning any new skill or trade, one begins with the easiest, most rudimentary concepts and progressively advances to the higher, more complex concepts. Poets of the 17th century often adapted themselves to this career model, which was based on arguments made by Sir Philip Sidney in his Defense of Poetry. It's a monumental piece of criticism written in the early 1580s and published posthumously in 1595. Regarding this pseudo-apprenticeship, Sidney writes, quote, "The shepherd's pipe, as sweet as any swan, gave us many days of rest. It brought us to the unspeakable high reaching of heroic poetry. These indeed are not men but gods. They frame matters of virtue, wisdom, and delight. Thus, in the noblest and highest kind of writing, poesy ariseth to teach, to move, and to delight. And so then the pastoral cometh low, yet as a pretty stepping stone to higher matters." In this passage, Sidney identifies the boundaries of poetic prestige. He places the pastoral at the bottom end. The sweet shepherd's pipe is the first subject of the novice poet. Gradually, the poet attains to heroic poetry, the epic, as the pinnacle of the form. This model was based on the career of the Roman poet Virgil, who began with his pastoral eclogues, moved to the more didactic Georgics, and finally produced the great epic Aeneid. So, in a similar vein, Edward Spenser began with his shepherd's calendar before producing The Fairy Queen. The grand exception to this usual grind is, of course, Shakespeare, who dabbled a bit in drama for a while, wrote a couple of sonnets and a few narrative poems. Never produced an epic, though some argue that the Henriade is his epic, but I think that's getting a little loose with the categories here, and I do like a good category. I bring this up because, well, John Milton followed Sidney's advice and worked in the lower pastoral forms before scaling the heights of Paradise Lost. Young John was the oldest child from a fairly well-to-do family, and he spent much of his youth devouring books like the Cookie Monster devours snickerdoodles, especially the classical Latin poets. The books, not the cookies. Evidently, he also loved Edmund Spenser, and is said to have declared that the English poet was, quote, "a better teacher than Aquinas." Now, I wonder if here we can see the seeds of Milton's rather fervent and revolutionary character. As we've seen, he was passionately devoted to the cause of the Puritan Revolution, and he devoted 2 decades of his life to promoting and defending it. But Milton's father was a Roman Catholic, and therefore probably quite a fan of St. Thomas Aquinas. And it's reported that he disinherited John when the son abandoned the faith of the father. Additionally, during the Civil War, John's brother fought on the royalist side. Feisty John even got himself expelled from Cambridge after only a year, but he returned later to produce his first great poem, his calling card to the literary world, that he intended to go places. That poem is Lycidas, a pastoral elegy written to commemorate the death by drowning of a fellow Cambridge student, Edward King, in 1637. Now, Milton had written 2 notable poems before this in his early college days, a pair of poems called L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, meaning the happy one and the pensive one, respectively. The first is a pleasing, quite charming musical pastoral in which the speaker invites the goddess Mirth to infuse his life. We then get the rather standard pastoral fare. Shepherds in idyllic scenery, a fire hose of classical illusion. He even throws in a few fairies. There's a bit of carpe diem and an allusion in the final lines to Marlowe's passionate shepherd. L'Allegro does give us a saying that persists down to our own day. You may have heard it. The nymph is invited to, quote, trip it as you go on the light fantastic toe. So, our phrase, trip the light fantastic, to mean graceful dancing, actually comes from Milton. This poem also name-checks Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare with 2 lines well known to people who like to read 17th century pastoral verse instead of actually living their lives. He speaks of Jonson's learned sock, a reference to the slippers comic actors wore in the classical period, and of Shakespeare's warbling, quote, his native wood notes wild. This latter is often taken as testimony to Shakespeare's natural purity, unspoiled by the formal training of a university. This quality is often cited by the Romantics when claiming Shakespeare as their literary ancestor. L'Allegro's partner poem, Il Penseroso, offers a melancholy counterpoint to the happy pastoral idyll. Here, the speaker seeks solitude with an eye toward experiencing the divine. Probably even more classical allusions than the first poem. The speaker aspires to scholarship and wisdom, after all. And we get a similar ending to L'Allegro, again echoing Marlowe, in which the speaker chooses melancholy over happiness as the partner of his life. These 2 are, as I say, lovely enough, and there's a real sense of musicality in the tetrameter verse. But they also seem very much, like portfolio pieces, like a working curriculum vitae. Here's what I can do. They seem a summary of the first stage of apprenticeship. I know my pastorals, I know their conventions and forms, I can spit references to Greece and Rome with the best of them. I am a serious poet. My card. If I'm honest, Lycidas has many of these qualities too. Bit of showboating from a gifted newcomer. But at the same time, it seems more complex, less derivative than his pastoral diptych. One can almost perceive Milton the man behind the speaker of this elegy. While the occasion for the poem was, as I have said, the drowning of a fellow student and the publication of a volume of elegies to memorialize that tragedy, Milton also uses the poem as an opportunity to muse upon his own path as a poet, to meditate upon the value of fame, and to excoriate the corruption of the church, because, Puritan. The fact that Milton does get a bit navel-gazy here has led some critics, notably the Titanic Dr. Johnson, to dismiss Lycidas as self-indulgent twaddle. But it's not twaddle, even if it's not entirely sincere. True, Milton hardly knew Edward King and probably found it difficult to summon the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion at the death of a slight acquaintance. And while we may find it distasteful to sublimate the deceased when analyzing an elegy on him, I think it helpful to think of Mr. King, at least as far as Lycidas goes, as a MacGuffin. What's that, you say? Well, a MacGuffin, as popularized by film director Alfred Hitchcock, is an object or event that's necessary to drive the plot or motivate the characters, but is otherwise kind of irrelevant. So, think about the search for R2-D2 at the beginning of the first Star Wars movie. It's enough to get Darth Vader and the Empire to Luke Skywalker's planet, and to get Luke to meet Obi-Wan Kenobi, but actually trying to recapture the droid becomes entirely extraneous once those pieces are in place. That's kind of the way I think about Edward King in Lycidas. His death is the impetus for the poem, but really has quite little to do with it. And if we look at it that way, the fact that Milton doesn't seem emotionally distraught is no longer a critical issue. Okay, so let's take a good close look at Milton's first major poem. As I said, it's a pastoral elegy, so a poem of lament with all the accoutrement of an idealized rural setting. The name Lycidas has a long and distinguished pedigree in pastoral poetry. I believe we first get the name mentioned in Herodotus's 5th century BC histories of the Persian War. I think Lycidas is a Greek counselor who gets stoned for wanting to give in to the Persians. So this is probably not the Lycidas Milton is referencing. Neither is the centaur from Ovid's Metamorphoses. More likely is the one mentioned by Theocritus, the goat herd with a penchant for poetry, and one of the several mentions we get from Virgil too, probably. There's also, I think, a Lycidas in Lucan who gets ripped off a ship, so he's a fair candidate. By transforming Edward King, aspiring cleric and poet, into the shepherd Lycidas, Milton takes up a quite traditional practice. And indeed, much of the poem is conventional, but so much more is not, which is why I think it surpasses his earlier verse. So first of all, in a headnote added in 1645, the poem announces itself as a monody, that is, a lament sung by a single voice. As we'll see, there are several speakers here. Other eccentricities and innovations we will note in due course. The poem opens with a conventional apostrophe to the Muses, here metaphorized as the laurels, for the laurel crowns worn by ancient poets laureate. Quote, "Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more, ye myrtles brown, with ivy never sere, I come to pluck your berries harsh and crude, and with forced fingers rude shatter your leaves before the mellowing year. Bitter constraint and sad occasion dear compels me to disturb your season due. For Lycidas is dead, dead ere his prime, young Lycidas, and hath not left his peer."
Hey, book lovers, I'm Sarah, and I co-host Reading Between the Lines podcast with my mom, Nicole. While we might have totally different tastes in fiction, we definitely share the same passion for great stories. And on our podcast, we dive into honest reviews and thoughtful recommendations to help you skip the books you won't finish and find the ones you will absolutely love. Whether it's dark academia, literary fiction, or even thrilling sci-fi, which is my favorite, Nicole and I have you covered. Subscribe to Reading Between the Lines now, wherever you listen to podcasts, and let us help you discover your next favorite read.
The berries of line 3 are his ripening verse, which is yet premature, he says, with some false modesty, I presume. It's unripe. His lines are, quote, harsh and crude. And that may appear true to one expecting the regular rhythm of pentameter poetry, the smooth musicality of l'allegro or il penseroso. But look more closely at Lycidas's opening lines, and you'll see that Milton very rapidly abandons any predictable meter or rhyme scheme. Line 4 is deliberately stunted at 6 syllables, and it ends with the rhyme rude, as if to exemplify this illusion of primitivism. Further, the speaker casts himself as a gauche interloper. The verbs are those of bumbling interference, pluck, shatter, disturb. But, of course, what else can be expected? Lycidas died before his prime, and I, his elegist, am not yet ready to properly mourn him. He's not going to let a little humility stop him, obviously. He hopes for a little forward-paying quid pro quo. He says, quote, so may some gentle muse with lucky words favor my destined urn, and as he passes turn and bid fair peace be to my sable shroud. We're not yet 20 lines in, and already the speaker betrays hints that this meditation is on himself. He sees in Lycidas the reflection of his own aspirations for his life, his hopes for the future. Lycidas is a foil for the speaker. Quote, for we were nursed upon the self-same hill, fed the same flock by fountain, shade, and rill. The Cambridge experience here is rendered as caring for their flocks on an Arcadian hill. 2, both Lycidas and the speaker wrote pastoral rhymes to make the wood nymphs dance. Quote, meanwhile, the rural ditties were not mute, tempered to the oaten flute. The oaten flute here is a metonym for pastoral verse, right? Like pan flutes made out of reeds, that kind of thing. But Lycidas's death violates the idyll so far constructed. Quote, but oh, the heavy change now thou art gone and never must return. Nature now seems chaotic, disordered, and unfixed. The speaker marvels at the, quote, wild time and the gadding vine o'ergrown, and mourns that his friend's death and the loss of the poetry he would write is as, quote, killing as the canker to the rose, frost to flowers that their gay wardrobe wear. The speaker blames the nature deities for failing to protect Lycidas, railing against what he sees as their incompetence or indifference. But then he relents. Quote, ay me, I fondly dream, had ye been there, for what could that have done? We feel a certain resignation here, perhaps even the recognition that he is projecting his grief. He links Lycidas to Orpheus, whose mother was unable to protect him from a gory death at the hands of the Bacchantes. Now, you'll see this a few times in the poem, this trick of Milton's in which what might have been a moment of genuine emotion gets sublimated by a classical or biblical allusion, almost as if he redirects an emotional response to an intellectual one. The trouble is, sometimes this almost borders on nihilism. Line 64 begins a meditation on fame. Quote, alas, what boots it with incessant care to tend the homely slighted shepherd's trade and strictly meditate the thankless muse? The pastoral ideal is shattered, or at least questionable, yet still Milton romanticizes it. So now we are firmly in Milton's speaker's own head, maybe Milton's himself. King has pretty much been left behind, poor MacGuffin. His classmate's death has clearly brought intimations of mortality to Milton's mind, and so at the age of 29, Milton is still trying to figure out if the path he has planned for himself to become a great poet is worth the effort and deprivation in so fleeting and transient a life. He says, quote, "Fame is the spur that the clear spirit doth raise, that last infirmity of noble mind, to scorn delights and live laborious days. But the fair guerdon when we hope to find and think to burst out into sudden blaze, comes the blind fury with the abhorred shears and slits the thin-spun life." Is it all worth it? The asceticism that poetry demands, the sacrifice of earthly, and in more classical allusions he implies sexual, pleasure. Perhaps to die before greatness is attained and thus have wasted the thin-spun life? Yes, he decides, yes it is. Phoebus Apollo, god of the sun and poetry and music, reprimands the speaker's timidity. Quote, "Fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil, nor in the glistening foil sets off to the world, nor in the broad rumor lies, but lives and spreads aloft by those pure eyes and perfect witness of all judging Jove, as he pronounces lastly on each deed, with so much fame in heaven expect thy meed." Fame is worth it. It's better than earthly mortal pleasure because it outlasts mortality. Life ends, praise does not. And we've seen this conceit many times before, going all the way back to Beowulf, who seeks immortality through the songs of his glorious deeds. Spenser's Sonnet 75 and Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 and Sonnet 55, in which poetry itself confers immortality. What does strike me as a little odd, however, is that tension between Milton's stern Puritanism and this pagan come humanistic vision of immortality. Now, I wonder if we can see traces of the Puritan doctrine of election, whereby God has already chosen those whom he will save. I wonder if we can see some of that in Milton's imagining of literary anesthesia, of literary Athanasia. After Apollo's lofty speech, Lycidas settles back into more rustic simplicity. The speaker's ote proceeds after Phoebus's higher mood. But strangely, the next section feels like a mythic inquest, like a coroner's hearing to determine the conditions of blame for Lycidas' death. First witness, Neptune, god of the sea, who absolves himself by blaming, quote, "the fatal and perfidious bark." Hey, the weather was fine. It was the crappy ship that killed Lycidas. Don't look at me. Neptune's alibi introduces an interesting idea, though, that it was not nature that took the young man's life, but the work of humans. People built something faulty, and therein lies the cause of death. This tiny little germ of an idea gives Milton license to do a bit of puritanical haranguing. St. Peter himself takes the stand, quote, "the pilot of the Galilean lake," to condemn the high church as a human institution divorced from the will of God, as the cause of death. He shakes his mitred locks and says, quote, "How well could I have spared for thee, young swain, and now of such as for their belly's sake creep and intrude and climb into the fold. Of other care they little reckoning make, and how to scramble at the shearer's feast and shove away the worthy bidden guest. Blind mouths that scarce themselves know how to hold a sheep-hook, or have learned aught else the least that to the faithful herdsman's art belongs. What recks it them? What need they? They are sped. And when they list their lean and flashy songs, grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw, the hungry sheep look up and are not fed, but swollen with wind and the rank mist they draw, rot inwardly, and foul contagion spread. Besides what the grim wolf with privy paw daily devours apace, and nothing said. But that two-handed engine at the door stands ready to smite once, and smite no more. Okay, so now the pastoral idea gets mixed up with the ecclesiastical idea. Pastors, ministers, priests, as shepherds of God's flock. St. Peter says he would rather have lost many hypocritical, gluttonous, proud priests than have lost Lycidas and his simple, pure faith. I think things get a little tangled here, because we have to assume that Peter is really talking about Edward King, studying for the ministry, and not the swain persona Lycidas. But never mind that. Not gonna let a little structural inconsistency interfere with a good anti-clerical tongue lashing. Perhaps the most famous image from Peter's polemic here is when he calls the priesthood blind mouths. The quality of blindness, a lack of sight signifying ignorance, both willful and unwillful, is conflated with mouth as a metonym for gluttony, consumption without conscience. It's kind of an example of what literary scholars call linguistic synesthesia, which is when a writer renders one of the physical senses in terms of another. Like when in King Lear, Shakespeare writes of warmth, which is detected by the sense of touch, as being gorgeous, which is, of course, perceived by vision. Anyway, it's a pretty damning metaphor for a clergy charged with the oversight. Now, oversight, by the way, is the root of the word bishop, for those of you keeping score at home. So it's a damning metaphor for clergy who are charged with overseeing and caring for God's flock. The clergy are ignorant shepherds, not true shepherds like the swains. And it's a condemnation of the institutional church by the guy who founded the institutional church. That's heavy, brother. Another rather well-known image from Peter's speech comes at its very end. The apostle speaks of a two-handed engine at the door, which stands ready to smite once and smite no more. Perhaps well-known is an inapt phrase. Well, people know about it, but no one's really sure they know what it means. It's clearly a warning of an impending apocalyptic ass-thrashing, but we only have guesses as to what Milton's two-handed engine actually is. Is it the two houses of Parliament? A sword so big you need two hands to wield it? Is it the Gospel's double-edged sword, St. Michael's sword, the sword of justice? Is it an executioner's axe? No one's really nailed it down. So opportunity awaits for any of you grad students out there looking for a dissertation topic. After the dread voice of Peter's wrath, Milton once again settles into comfortable pastoral convention. We are treated to a reverie, a burgeoning nature returning to life, a resurrection. Flowers of 1,000 hues burst forth, showers are like honey, and the brooks gush down the hillsides. Among the blooming flowers is the amaranthus, which, according to legend, never fades and is thus immortal, just like Lycidas, and just like Milton's speaker. We get one more kind of classical allusion in which Lycidas is likened to the day star, like the sun that dips beneath the ocean's horizon each night but rises from it each morning. So, okay, bog standard archetypal symbol, ties in nicely with the Phoebus Apollo thing earlier. But then there's a little shift. Maybe, if I really wanted to push it, a sun, S-U-N, son, S-O-N, pun. Milton writes that Lycidas, quote, sunk low but mounted high through the dear might of him that walked the waves. Aha! Lycidas will rise again like Jesus, who famously took a stroll on the stormy Sea of Galilee and blew his disciples' minds. So here at the end of the poem, Milton abandons his classical allusions, which it seems now are only useful in conveying the experience and reality of death, and turns to Christian metaphor. Christ is the good shepherd who did not fall into the waters, like St. Peter did through his doubt. Now the poem favors resurrection motifs that it finds lacking in its understanding of classical mythology. Lycidas ends by pulling one more fast one. The last stanza begins, quote, thus sang the uncouth swain to the oaks and rills. Wait a minute. That means that the speaker we've been listening to isn't even the real speaker. It's a speaker overhearing another speaker who heard Peter and Camus and Neptune and all the other babblers in this so-called monody. Pretty tricksy, Milton. The last image in the poem of a second speaker observing the singing swain who has risen and, quote, twitched his mantle blue, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new, that troubles many readers who see in it the root of the poem's failure. For these readers, this closing scene indicates a distance, an emotional gap between what we've read and what we are supposed to feel, what we're supposed to experience. The poem feels cold to many readers. Its constant reference to classical literature seems like intellectual signaling. Its language feels overblown, sometimes even hyperbolic, because really, King was not that good a poet. Many find the mixture of subtopics confusing and ill-balanced. That great bear of a man, Samuel Johnson, as I mentioned in the introduction to this episode, greatly despised Lycidas. His 1781 critical work, Lives of the Poets, takes a brickbat to Milton's pastoral elegy. And everyone likes a good takedown, don't they? It's the only reason most people read restaurant reviews, just to hear the place get trashed. So, in that spirit, let's sample a few items from Dr. Johnson's plate. Regarding the pastoral form itself, the good doctor sees it as having been moribund even a century and a half earlier when Milton worked on it. Quote, its form is that of a pastoral, easy, vulgar, and therefore disgusting. Whatever images it can supply are long ago exhausted, and its inherent improbability always forces dissatisfaction on the mind. Therefore, obviously, Johnson argues, quote, it is not to be considered as the effusion of real passion, for passion runs not after remote illusions and obscure opinions. Passion plucks no berries from the myrtle and ivy, nor calls upon Erethus or Mincius, nor tells of rough satyrs and fawns with cloven heel. Where there is leisure for fiction, there is little grief. In this poem, there is no nature, for there is no truth. There is no art, for there is nothing new. Well, no mincing words there. But Johnson's denunciation stands out because it is so much the voice of the minority. Most critics, while bowing to certain complaints about the elegy, regard it as overall a masterful and slyly innovative piece of work, addressing the conventions of the form, but unafraid to transgress those conventions when meaning or effect could be amplified. Actually, everything one says about Lycidas is true. It's grand, it's pompous, it's nuanced, it's cliched, it's revolutionary, it's bombastic, it's gentle. That plenitude is what makes it great, I think. and why Milton would go on to become one of the language's greatest practitioners, and why the fame he sought is so richly deserved. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Classic English Literature Podcast. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, and follow the show. Tell a few friends about it. Word of mouth is a great way to build our community. If you feel like buying me a beer, click the support the show button. I'm always thirsty and always grateful. I hope the next couple of weeks are absolute magic for you. Tell me all about them when we get together again. Bye now.